Daniel Reed had never seen so many alien faces staring at him with such unified disappointment. The tribunal chamber stretched wide enough to hold representatives from 40 different species, and every single one of them looked like they wanted him gone. His uniform felt too tight around the collar, or maybe that was just the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders. Cadet Reed. Commander Brell's voice cut through the silence like a blade. The Arthanian's exoskeleton clicked as he moved, each segment of his armor-like body reflecting the harsh lights overhead. You understand why you stand before us. It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered anyway. Yes, sir. I broke formation during the rescue simulation. Broke formation. Brell repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. You abandoned your assigned position. You ignored direct orders. You compromised the entire exercise. Daniel kept his eyes forward. He'd been through this already during the initial hearing, but the tribunal wanted to hear it again. They always did. The simulation parameters changed, sir. Civilians were in the kill zone. Simulated civilians. A council member from the back spoke up, her voice carrying the musical quality of the Quillan species. Digital constructs, Cadet. Not real people. They responded like real people. Daniel's jaw tightened. They screamed like real people. And the training manual says we protect non-combatants regardless of mission objectives. Brell slammed one clawed appendage against the podium. The training manual also emphasizes chain of command. Following orders. Military discipline. Without these principles, we have chaos. The tribunal murmured agreement. Daniel watched as species who normally disagreed on everything found common ground in his punishment. A human cadet had stepped out of line, and now they would make an example of him. Let me show you something. Brell activated the holographic display. Footage from the simulation played across the chamber. Daniel saw himself breaking from his unit, sprinting toward the endangered zone while his squad continued their assigned assault pattern. He watched himself pull 3 civilian avatars from a collapsing structure seconds before simulated explosions consumed the area. Heroic. Brell's tone dripped with sarcasm. And completely unauthorized. Your squad missed their target window because you weren't in position. In a real combat scenario, that delay could have cost lives. In a real combat scenario, those civilians would be dead. Daniel met the commander's eyes. Sir. The chamber erupted. Half the council members argued for immediate expulsion. Others debated whether humans were even compatible with military structure. A few voices suggested leniency, but they were quickly drowned out. Daniel stood silent through it all. He'd known this was coming the moment he made his choice in that simulator. Sometimes doing the right thing meant facing consequences, and he'd accepted that. What he hadn't expected was what came next. Enough. The word came from Elder Cal, a Torvin who'd sat motionless through the entire proceeding. The ancient being's scales had faded to pale gray with age, but his presence commanded immediate silence. We have heard arguments for expulsion, for demotion, for reassignment. I propose an alternative. Brell's exoskeleton clicked with interest. Elder Gehenna 7. Cal spoke the name like a curse. We send the cadet to Gehenna 7. The chamber went dead silent. Daniel felt ice form in his stomach. Everyone knew about Gehenna 7. It was the punishment nobody survived. You can't be serious. The Quillan council member shot to her feet. That's a death sentence. He disobeyed orders. He didn't commit murder. He broke military law. Brell leaned forward, and Daniel could see the commander calculating. Gehenna 7 is designated for the worst offenders. Cadet Reed's actions, while not criminal, demonstrated a fundamental incompatibility with military service. The average survival time is 6 weeks. Another council member objected. You're executing him for trying to save lives. We're removing him from a position where his inability to follow orders could endanger real lives. Brell turned to Cal. Elder, I support this proposal. The vote happened quickly, too quickly for Daniel to fully process. Representatives raised appendages, tentacles, and limbs in favor. A few abstained. Fewer still voted against. But the majority carried. And just like that, Daniel's fate was sealed. Cadet Daniel Reed. Cal's ancient voice held something that might have been regret. You are hereby exiled to Gehenna, 7 for a period of no less than 6 months. You will be provided standard survival equipment and a neural uplink for data transmission. May you find what you seek in isolation. They led him out through a different corridor. The path to the transport bay felt longer than it should have. Other cadets stared as he passed, some with pity, most with fear. Nobody wanted to be associated with the exile.at, the transport bay. A young Quillen engineer pressed something into his hand while pretending to check his equipment harness. Daniel glanced down at the data chip, then up at the engineer's face. Her name tag read Pip. Humans are stubborn. She whispered the words quickly, her eyes darting to make sure nobody noticed. Prove them wrong. Before Daniel could respond, they were pushing him into the drop pod. The neural uplink attached to his skull with a cold snap, and the survival kit locked into place beside him. Through the viewport, he could see the faces of the tribunal members watching from an observation deck. They were already placing bets on how long he'd last. The pod launched without ceremony. One moment Daniel was staring at the assembled aliens who'd condemned him. The next he was tumbling through space toward a planet that killed everyone it touched. His last thought before atmospheric entry hit was simple. 6 weeks was their record. Time to set a new one. The impact drove every bit of air from Daniel's lungs. His pod had torn through Gehenna 7's atmosphere like a bullet through wet paper, and the crash landing felt like getting hit by a train. Metal screamed and bent around him. Safety restraints cut into his shoulders. Then everything went still except for the hissing of ruptured fuel lines and the distant sound of something roaring in the darkness beyond. Daniel's hands moved on autopilot, releasing restraints and grabbing his survival kit. The pod door refused to open until he kicked it 3 times, and when it finally gave way, he tumbled out on a ground that felt wrong under his boots. Too soft in some places, too hard in others, like the planet itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The air tasted like copper and rotting vegetation. Each breath burned going down, and Daniel's eyes watered from chemicals he couldn't name. His neural uplink beeped softly against his skull, already recording atmospheric data, toxicity levels, and his elevated heart rate. Somewhere in orbit, those readings were being transmitted to the Academy's network. They were waiting for him to die so they could study how it happened. He wasn't planning to give them that satisfaction. The landscape around him looked like something from a nightmare. Trees grew at impossible angles, their bark covered in what looked like moving scales. Plants with teeth snapped at insects that flew too close. The sky held 3 moons, and none of them were the right color. Everything about this place screamed danger, and Daniel's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. First priority was shelter. The pod was compromised, but parts of it could be salvaged. Daniel worked quickly, using tools from his kit to cut away sections of hull plating. His hands remembered training exercises. His mind cataloged everything useful. Hull plates became walls. Seating foam became insulation. The pod's emergency beacon became a perimeter alarm. Be why the time darkness fell. He had a basic shelter wedge between 2 of the twisted trees. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the rain off, and on Gehenna 7, the rain was apparently made of diluted acid. Daniel learned that the hard way when the first drops hit his exposed forearm and left red, whilst behind. The nights were worse than the days. Things moved in the darkness, things that sounded too big and too hungry. Daniel sat in a shelter with a piece of sharpened metal in one hand and his neural uplink recording every sound. The Academy wanted data? He'd give them data. Every noise, every movement, every pattern he could identify. On day 3, the predators found him. 6-legged things with crystalline armor that reflected his emergency light in fractured rainbows. They circled his shelter in perfect formation, testing his defenses, looking for weakness. Daniel counted 7 of them before he stopped counting and started planning that he couldn't fight them directly. They were faster, stronger, and they worked as a team. But humans had survived Earth by being smarter than things that wanted to eat them, and Daniel figured the same principles applied here. He studied their patterns, watched how they moved, noticed which one led and which ones followed. The trap took 2 days to build. Daniel used whole cables as tripwires and salvage battery packs as improvised charges. He baited them with food from his survival rations, drawing them into a narrow gap between rock formations. When they came fast, but speed didn't help when the ground itself turned hostile. 3 of them got caught in the cables. 2 more retreated when the charges went off. The pack leader hesitated, intelligent eyes fixing on Daniel's position, and in that moment he saw something that changed everything. These weren't just animals. They were thinking, adapting, learning from their mistakes. Daniel didn't kill the trapped ones. Instead, he carefully cut them free, moving slowly enough to show he meant no harm. They fled immediately, but they didn't come back that night, or the next night, or the night after that. By day 6, Daniel had established a routine. Wake before the 3 moons set. Check perimeter. Filter water using minerals he'd found near what passed for a stream. Test plants for toxicity using methods his grandfather taught him during camping trips back on Earth. Log everything in his neural uplink. Stay alive. The water filtration system was his proudest achievement. He combined local minerals with components from the pod's life support system to create something that actually worked. The water still tasted terrible, but it wouldn't kill him, and that counted as a win. That he found other wreckage too. Old crash sites scattered across the landscape like tombstones. Some were recent enough that Daniel could identify the species from the remains. Others had been there so long that the jungle had consumed them completely. But a few had supplies still intact, protected by the same crystalline growths that armored the local predators. Daniel learned to harvest those growths carefully, adding them to his own shelter's defenses. On day 7, his neural uplink sent its first scheduled upload. The signal transmitted everything he'd recorded over the past week. Environmental data, survival techniques, biological observations, and a crude map of the surrounding area. The Academy was expecting a death notice with maybe a few days of struggle beforehand. What they got instead was a comprehensive survival guide written by someone who had no intention of dying. Daniel sat in his shelter that night, eating something that might have been a local fruit or might have been a fungus. He honestly couldn't tell anymore. His body ached from a dozen minor injuries. His hands were blistered and cut. His uniform was shredded and stained with things he didn't want to identify. But he was alive, and according to the records, nobody else had made it this far. Somewhere in orbit, his upload was spreading across the galactic network. Students would analyze it. Strategists would debate his methods. And everyone would start to wonder the same thing, that if a human could survive 1 week on Gehenna 7, what else might humans be capable of? Daniel didn't know the answer to that question yet. But he had 5 more weeks to figure it out, and then he'd decide whether 5 weeks was enough or if he wanted to keep going just to prove a point. 3 weeks on Gehenna. 7 taught Daniel that paranoia wasn't a character flaw, it was a survival trait. Something had been watching him for the past 5 days, and whatever it was smart enough to stay just beyond his sensor range. The crystalline predators he'd encountered before moved in patterns he could track. This thing didn't. It was always there, but never visible, like a shadow that existed just outside his peripheral vision. His base camp had evolved from desperate shelter into something resembling actual habitation. Storage areas for filtered water. Drying racks for the purple vegetation that turned out to be edible after processing. Defensive barriers made from salvaged metal and local crystalline growth. The neural uplink transmitted updates every 72 hours, and each upload generated more attention back at the Academy. Students studied his techniques. Military analysts debated his methods. And somewhere, Commander Brell was probably furious that Daniel hadn't died yet. But the Watcher complicated everything. Daniel felt its presence strongest at night, when he sat by a small fire processing the day's gathered supplies. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement in the darkness beyond his perimeter. Something big, definitely predatory, but exhibiting behavior that didn't match any of the other species he'd cataloged. The storm came without warning on day 22. The 3 moons vanished behind clouds that looked like they'd been painted with ink and violence. Wind hit hard enough to tear at his shelter's anchoring points. Rain fell in sheets that burned skin on contact. Lightning arced between the twisted trees in colors that didn't exist in any natural spectrum Daniel knew. His shelter wouldn't hold. Daniel grabbed essential supplies and ran, following instinct more than logic. The Watcher's presence pulled at his awareness, leading him toward a rock formation he'd noted during earlier exploration. Caves honeycombed the stone, and Daniel dove into the nearest opening just as a lightning strike turned his former camp into molten slag. Inside the cave, emergency light from his kit revealed walls covered in markings. Not natural formations, but deliberate carvings, worn smooth by time, but still visible. Geometric patterns mixed with representations of the local fauna. And in the center, something that looked disturbingly like a star chart, though the constellations were wrong for this part of the galaxy. Gehenna 7 had a civilization once. Or at least, something intelligent had lived here long enough to leave records behind. Daniel traced the carvings with careful fingers, his neural uplink recording everything. The pattern suggested multiple species working together, or maybe one species that changed form over time. The timeline was impossible to determine, but the implications were staggering. This wasn't just a death world. It was a graveyard of something greater that a sound from deeper in the cave system made Daniel freeze. Not the wind, not the storm. Something breathing, heavy and labored, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone. The Watcher had followed him inside. Daniel's hand went to his improvised weapon, that sharpened piece of hull metal he'd carried since the first week. His light swept across the cave tunnel, and finally, after 5 days of hunting, he saw what had been stalking him. The creature was massive, easily 3 times his size. Its body combined features from a dozen different Earth animals into something that shouldn't work, but clearly did. Bear-like bulk, reptilian scales, 6 legs ending in claws that could shred steel, eyes that reflected his light with disturbing intelligence. And it was caught in wreckage from an old military transport, cables and metal wrapped around its midsection like a trap that had been slowly killing it for who knew how long. The creature growled, a sound that vibrated through Daniel's chest, but it didn't attack. It couldn't. The wreckage held it pinned against the cave wall, and from the wounds visible beneath the cables, infection had set in days ago. Every survival instinct Daniel possessed screamed at him to run. This thing could tear him apart if it got free. It probably wanted to tear him apart, given that he was convenient prey. But Daniel had spent 3 weeks learning to read Gehenna 7's ecosystem, and he'd learned one crucial thing. Intelligence meant opportunity. Easy. Daniel spoke softly, knowing the creature couldn't understand his words, but hoping tone would translate. Let me see what we're dealing with here. He approached slowly, hands visible, movements predictable. The creature watched him with eyes that tracked every gesture. When Daniel got close enough to examine the wreckage, he understood why it hadn't been able to escape. The cables had tightened over time, cutting deeper with every attempt to break free. One wrong move, and they'd slice through vital organs. Daniel's survival kit included basic medical supplies meant for humans. They probably wouldn't work on alien physiology, but the antiseptic should at least clean wounds, and the cutting torch could handle the cables if he was careful. Very careful. It took 2 hours. Daniel worked in silence, cutting cables one strand at a time, pausing whenever the creature tensed, ready to bolt if it decided to attack. He cleaned wounds with precious medical supplies, applied bandages where he could, and talked constantly about nothing just to maintain a calm atmosphere. The creature never attacked. It watched, and Daniel saw the exact moment when wariness shifted into something else. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. An acknowledgement that maybe not every being on this planet was an enemy. When the last cable fell away, the creature pulled itself free with a groan that sounded almost relieved. It tested its legs one at a time, movement stiff from captivity. Then it looked at Daniel, and in that look was a question. Daniel sat back against the cave wall, exhausted from tension and effort. "You're welcome. Now we wait out the storm, and then you go your way and I go mine." "Deal." The creature settled onto its haunches near the cave entrance, positioning itself between Daniel and any potential threats from outside. It didn't leave. It didn't attack. It just watched, the same way it had been watching for 5 days. Daniel decided to call it Scout because that seemed like what it had been doing. Scouting him, learning his patterns, deciding whether he was threat or opportunity. And apparently, it had decided he was worth keeping alive. His neural uplink recorded every detail, building a file on xenobiological intelligence that would revolutionize how the galaxy understood predator behavior. But more importantly, Daniel had found something he hadn't expected on this death world: an ally. Week 7 arrived with Daniel finally understanding the fundamental truth about Gehenna 7. The planet wasn't trying to kill him. It was testing him. Every predator, every toxic plant, every environmental hazard worked together in a balance, so precise it couldn't be natural. Someone had engineered this nightmare, and Daniel was starting to figure out why. Scout hunted with him now, the massive creature proving surprisingly good at driving prey toward Daniel's traps. They developed a working relationship built on mutual benefit and something that might have been respect. When Scout growled low in his throat, Daniel knew to take cover. When Daniel signaled with specific hand gestures, Scout knew to circle around for an ambush. It shouldn't work, but it did, and Daniel's latest uploads included detailed observations on cross-species cooperation that had xenobiologists across the galaxy arguing in academic forums. His compound had expanded beyond simple survival into actual research. Storage systems organized by plant toxicity levels. Water filtration arrays that could process enough for 2 beings instead of 1. Charts and diagrams carved into rock faces showing predator migration patterns, plant growth cycles, and a complex food web that made Gehenna 7 function. That's when Daniel noticed the pattern. The crystalline predators only hunted during certain lunar phases. The herbivores migrated on predictable schedules. The toxic plants bloomed in cycles that alternated with edible vegetation growth. Everything connected, everything balanced, everything served a purpose. This wasn't a natural ecosystem. This was a laboratory. His neural uplink transmitted the theory along with supporting data. Gehenna 7 had been terraformed centuries ago as a biological weapons testing ground. Different species introduced from across the galaxy, gene-modified for maximum lethality, then left to compete and evolve. The planet wasn't chaotic. It was the most carefully designed death trap anyone had ever created, and then the creators had abandoned their experiment. The response from the galactic scientific community came faster than usual. Heated debates filled the networks. Some called Daniel's theory absurd. Others found it disturbingly plausible. But everyone agreed on one thing. If he was right, Gehenna 7 represented the greatest xenobiological research opportunity in recorded history, which was exactly when the poachers arrived. Scout noticed them first, unusual tension in his posture as he stared up at the sky. Daniel followed his gaze and saw the ship descending through atmosphere, running dark without proper clearance signals. He'd spent enough time around military vessels to recognize illegal configuration when he saw it. These weren't researchers or rescue teams. These were hunters looking for valuable specimens. His neural uplink lit up with incoming transmissions. The poacher ship had open channels demanding territorial rights, claiming salvage priority on abandoned world. Daniel's response was simple and direct. Gehenna 7 isn't abandoned. Leave now or face consequences. They laughed at him. A single human exile couldn't threaten a fully armed poaching crew. They'd harvest what they wanted and be gone before anyone could stop them. They were wrong. The first landing shuttle touched down in what Daniel had mapped as a neutral zone, an area where predator territories overlapped. The poachers exited with stun weapons and containment gear, ready to capture whatever looked profitable. They never noticed the warning signs Daniel had learned to read. The way certain plants contracted their leaves. The specific pattern of bird-like creatures fleeing the canopy. The sudden absence of ambient noise. The ecosystem responded to the threat with coordinated precision. Crystalline predators emerged from 3 directions simultaneously. Flying creatures that Daniel had classified as scavengers dove from above, their beaks capable of piercing standard armor. Even the plants got involved. root systems shifting to create trip hazards while thorn vines reached for exposed skin. The poachers panicked, opening fire with weapons designed to stun but modified for lethal force. That was their second mistake. The first was landing. The second was making the planet bleed. Gehenna 7 fought back with everything it had. Predators that normally competed with each other formed temporary packs. Herbivores that usually fled became aggressive defenders. The entire ecosystem shifted into war mode, and the poachers found themselves surrounded by a planet that really didn't want them there. Daniel watched from his compound, Scout tense beside him. He could let it happen. Let the planet kill the intruders and solve the problem permanently. But that wasn't who he was, and it wasn't who he wanted to be. Scout, we're going in. They reached the landing site at a full run, Daniel using his knowledge of safe paths, while Scout cleared obstacles with raw strength. 2 poachers were already down, wounded but alive. 3 more had formed a defensive circle, weapons blazing at everything that moved. The ecosystem pressed closer, and Daniel knew they had minutes before nobody made it out. He triggered his neural uplink's emergency broadcast, sending out a signal that combined recorded predator calls with frequencies that caused the local fauna pain. It was cruel, and he hated using it, but it worked. The coordinated attack faltered as creatures pulled back, confused by signals that came from their own kind, but felt wrong. Stop shooting, and I can get you out. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos. Keep firing, and the planet kills us all. To their credit, the poachers stopped immediately. Survival instinct overrode pride. Daniel guided them back to his compound, Scout providing rear guard against any creatures brave enough to follow. The wounded needed medical attention beyond Daniel's supplies, but he did what he could while broadcasting for emergency extraction. The rescue ship arrived within hours, responding to his distress signal with impressive speed. They collected the poachers and offered to take Daniel too. Standard protocol for anyone stranded on hostile worlds. Daniel refused. I'm not stranded. He stood at his compound's entrance with Scout beside him, both of them covered in mud and blood and proof of survival. I'm exactly where I need to be. The rescue captain argued. Command would override him. The tribunal would demand his return. None of it mattered. Daniel had 7 weeks of data proving Gehenna. 7 wasn't a death sentence. It was a responsibility. As the rescue ship departed, taking confused poachers and unanswered questions back to civilization, Daniel returned to his charts and observations. His next upload would change everything, and the galaxy was finally ready to listen. Scouts settled beside him, and together they watched the 3 moons rise over a planet that had stopped being an enemy and started being home. The delegation arrived on day 93, and Daniel knew his exile was about to get complicated. 3 transport ships descended through Gehenna 7's atmosphere in perfect formation, broadcasting clearance codes that marked them as official tribunal business. He watched from his observation point while Scout growled softly beside him, the creature's instincts recognizing authority figures even if he couldn't understand the political implications. Daniel had spent 3 months turning a death sentence into a home. His compound now featured proper structures built from salvaged materials and local resources. Water systems that filtered enough for a small research team. Gardens where he cultivated edible plants alongside samples for study. And everywhere, detailed documentation of an ecosystem that was finally revealing its secrets. His uploads had become required viewing at the academy. Students analyzed his survival techniques. Researchers debated his ecological theories. And somewhere in all that attention, Daniel had stopped being an exiled cadet and become something else entirely. A symbol, maybe, or a problem that needed solving. Commander Brell emerged from the lead transport first, his Arthanian exoskeleton gleaming in the sunlight filtered through Gehenna 7's strange atmosphere. The tribunal members followed, along with several beings Daniel didn't recognize wearing the insignia of the Galactic Scientific Coalition. They looked uncomfortable in their environmental suits, and Daniel felt a small satisfaction knowing he'd adapted to breathing this air while they still needed artificial support. Cadet Reed. Brell's voice carried across the compound. You've been busy. Staying alive requires effort, sir. Daniel didn't salute. Exile had technically removed him from military authority, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The delegation toured his compound while Daniel provided narration like some kind of twisted field trip guide. He showed them the water filtration systems, the defensive perimeters that worked with the local fauna instead of against them, the charts documenting seasonal patterns. Scout followed at a distance, watching the newcomers with obvious distrust. Elderkel studied everything in silence, those ancient Torvan eyes missing nothing. The other tribunal members whispered among themselves, their body language ranging from impressed to uncomfortable. But it was the Scientific Coalition representatives who showed real interest, asking detailed questions about reproduction cycles, predator behavior, and the evidence supporting Daniel's laboratory theory. They gathered in what Daniel called his meeting area, a cleared space with seating carved from local rock. Brel stood while everyone else sat, a power play that Daniel recognized but chose to ignore. The tribunal has reviewed your uploads. Brel began without preamble. Your survival has been noted. Your research has generated significant interest. And your actions during the poaching incident demonstrated both initiative and responsibility. Daniel waited. There was always a but coming. We're prepared to offer full pardon. Brel continued. Restoration of your cadet status with commendations. A position in the Academy's research division. An advisory role in developing new survival training protocols based on your methods. One of the Scientific Coalition representatives leaned forward eagerly. We also propose establishing a permanent research station on Gehenna 7, with you as chief consultant. Full funding, comprehensive support, and priority access to all findings. It was everything Daniel could have wanted 3 months ago. Recognition, restoration, and the chance to continue his work with proper resources. But 3 months on Gehenna 7 had changed his priorities. What happens to the planet? Daniel asked. Brel's exoskeleton clicked with what might have been confusion. Gehenna 7 remains designated as it was. A restricted world, unsuitable for colonization, useful primarily for its deterrent value. So it stays a prison. It serves its purpose. Brel's tone suggested the topic wasn't open for debate. Your survival doesn't change the planet's fundamental nature. Daniel looked at Scout, who'd positioned himself near the delegation, but not threateningly. Then he looked at the compound he'd built, the ecosystem he'd learned to read, the research that proved Gehenna 7 was more than just a death trap. Then I refuse your offer. The silence that followed was absolute. Tribunal members stared. The Scientific Coalition representatives looked shocked. Even Brel seemed caught off guard. Explain yourself. The commander's voice carried warning. You sent me here to die as punishment. Daniel stood, meeting Brel's eyes directly. Instead, I found something worth protecting. This planet isn't a prison. It's a living laboratory containing centuries of evolutionary data. And you want to keep using it to kill people who don't follow orders. It serves as deterrent. Brel insisted. It serves as waste. Daniel countered. You're sitting on the most significant xenobiological research site in recorded history and using it as a trash bin for cadets who think differently. What exactly are you proposing? Elder Cal spoke for the first time, and something in those ancient eyes suggested this was the question he'd been waiting to ask. Reclassify Gehenna 7 as a protected nature preserve. Establish a research station, but with strict protocols that respect the ecosystem. And stop sending people here to die when they could be sent here to learn. Brel's exoskeleton rattled with what Daniel recognized as anger. You're demanding we reward you for disobedience. I'm demanding you stop punishing people for having compassion. Daniel gestured at his compound, at Scout, at everything he'd built. You wanted me to learn a lesson about following orders. Instead, I learned that survival isn't about being the strongest or the most obedient. It's about adaptation, respect, and understanding that sometimes the most dangerous places become home when you stop fighting them. The delegation argued among themselves in a dozen languages. Brel wanted Daniel court-martialed for demanding terms. The Scientific Coalition saw the logic in protecting their research site. Other tribunal members fell somewhere in between, but it was young Pip who broke the stalemate. The Quillen engineer had come with the delegation, promoted since Daniel last saw her. She stepped forward carrying a data chip that looked very familiar. Elder Cal, members of the tribunal. Her voice shook but held firm. I have evidence that previous exiles survived longer than official records indicate. Months, even years in some cases. But their data was suppressed to maintain Gehenna 7's reputation. She loaded the chip into a portable display. Logs appeared showing survival times that far exceeded 6 weeks. Food preservation techniques, shelter improvements, even early attempts at ecosystem mapping. All of it buried in classified archives to prevent anyone from learning that Gehenna 7 could be survived with proper knowledge. The tribunal erupted in accusations and denials. But Elder Cal raised one aged appendage, and silence fell immediately. The vote will proceed. His voice carried absolute authority. Gehenna 7's reclassification as protected preserve. All in favor. 6 months after the tribunal's vote, Daniel stood on the observation deck of what used to be his crude compound and watched the Gehenna 7 research station begin its morning operations. The facility had grown carefully, each structure positioned to minimize ecosystem disruption while maximizing research capability. Scientists from 40 different species worked in teams, studying everything from predator migration patterns to the medicinal properties of plants Daniel had first tested on himself out of desperate necessity. Scout dozed in a custom-built shelter nearby, comfortable enough with the station's presence that he no longer growled at every new arrival. Other native creatures had adapted similarly, learning that the strange buildings and their inhabitants weren't threats as long as boundaries were respected. The planet's ecosystem had accepted human presence the same way it accepted everything else, with careful evaluation followed by integration. Morning, boss. Pip approached carrying data pads and what passed for coffee in this part of the galaxy. She transferred to the research station permanently, claiming she wanted to study adaptive engineering in hostile environments. Daniel suspected she just enjoyed being part of something that proved the tribunal wrong. Stop calling me boss. Daniel accepted the coffee. It tasted terrible, but everything tasted terrible on Gehenna 7 until you got used to it. I'm a consultant, remember? A consultant who gets final approval on every major decision. Pip grinned. That's basically a boss. The research station operated under strict protocols that Daniel had helped establish. Limited population to prevent ecosystem strain. Mandatory survival training for all personnel. Absolute prohibition on weapons except for emergencies. And most importantly, recognition that they were guests on a planet that had survived just fine without them. The data they gathered revolutionized galactic understanding of hostile environment adaptation. Daniel's techniques became standard curriculum at every military academy, though the emphasis had shifted from punishment to education. Cadets still came to Gehenna 7, but now they came to learn rather than die, and the survival rate had improved dramatically. Commander Brell visited occasionally, each trip slightly less hostile than the last. He'd never apologized directly, but his presence during training sessions suggested a grudging respect for methods he'd once considered insubordination. During his most recent visit, he'd even asked Daniel's advice on reforming the Academy's leadership training programs. We have incoming. Pip checked her data pad. New batch of cadets for survival training. 23 from various species, including 5 humans. Daniel finished his terrible coffee and headed for the landing pad. This was his favorite part of the job, watching newcomers experience the same shock he'd felt upon arrival. The difference was they had knowledge now, preparation, and the understanding that Gehenna 7 tested you, but didn't have to kill you. The transport landed smoothly, and cadets emerged looking nervous and determined in equal measure. Their instructor was a veteran officer from the Quillen military, trained in Daniel's methods and experienced in hostile environment operations. She saluted Daniel with genuine respect. Ready for another group? She asked. Always. Daniel gestured toward the training area, a section of wilderness that provided authentic challenges while remaining within emergency response range. They'll spend 2 weeks learning basic survival, then another 2 on ecosystem integration. Anyone who completes the program gets certified for advanced operations. One of the human cadets approached, young and eager with that look Daniel remembered from his own academy days. "Sir, is it true you survived here for 3 months alone?" "It's true," Daniel confirmed. "But I had advantages you don't." The cadet looked confused. "Advantages?" "Sir, you had nothing. I had motivation." Daniel smiled. "I was trying to prove people wrong. You're trying to prove yourselves right. That's easier, but it requires the same principles: adaptation, respect, and understanding that strength isn't about dominating your environment. It's about becoming part of it." Scout emerged from his shelter, stretching in a way that still looked vaguely threatening despite Daniel knowing it was just a yawn. The cadets tensed, but Daniel remained relaxed. "This is Scout." He introduced the creature like he was introducing a colleague. "He'll be observing your training. Think of him as a teaching assistant who'll eat you if you're too stupid to survive." The instructor laughed while the cadets looked uncertain whether that was a joke. Daniel let them wonder. A little healthy fear kept people cautious, and caution was what kept them alive. Over the next weeks, Daniel watched another group learn what he'd learned through desperation: how to read the ecosystem's warning signs, how to harvest resources without depleting them, how to defend yourself by avoiding conflict rather than escalating it, and most importantly, how to recognize that every environment, no matter how hostile, had rules that could be learned and respected. The graduation ceremony happened on a cliff overlooking the compound, all 23 cadets having completed their training successfully. Daniel presented each one with a certification chip containing their survival data, and in each face he saw the same transformation he'd experienced. They'd arrived as soldiers following orders. They left as survivors who understood adaptation. After the ceremony, Daniel returned to his original shelter, preserved now as both memorial and reminder. He sat where he'd sat that first night, exhausted and terrified, and looked up at the 3 moons that no longer seemed wrong. Elder Cal had sent a message earlier that day. The Galactic Council was debating expansion of the Adaptive Preserve program to other dangerous worlds, with humans proposed as the ideal species to lead the initiative. Not because humans were strongest or fastest or most technologically advanced, but because they had demonstrated an unusual ability to find common ground even on planets that killed everyone else. Daniel's response had been simple. He'd consider it, but only if Scout came along. After all, any new world would need an ambassador who understood that survival wasn't a solo mission. His neural uplink transmitted its regular update, carrying data on ecosystem changes, research progress, and training outcomes to the galactic network. The uploads that started as death records had become something entirely different. They were proof that exile didn't have to mean ending. Sometimes it meant beginning. Scout settled beside him, comfortable and alert, watching the horizon where new transport ships would eventually arrive with more cadets, more researchers, more beings ready to learn what a death world could teach them about survival. Daniel closed his eyes and listened to Gehenna 7's symphony of dangerous life, finding peace in sounds that used to terrify him. The tribunal had sent him here to die. Instead, he'd found purpose, built community, and proved that sometimes the harshest punishment became the greatest opportunity. Not bad for someone who just couldn't follow orders.